The emergency room fell silent as Dr. Sarah Beth Coleman stepped back from the examination table, her latex gloves frozen mid-air above Eugene McCarthy's exposed scalp. What she saw defied 30 years of medical training. The bumps weren't just growths. They were alive, pulsing with their own rhythm beneath the old man's weathered skin. Nurse Margaret O'Sullivan dropped her clipboard with a metallic clatter, the sound echoing through the sterile corridor like a gunshot. Two orderlies backed toward the doorway, their faces pale as moonlight. The overhead fluorescent lights seemed to flicker in response to the collective intake of breath from everyone present. Gene's weathered fingers traced the spot where his late wife Martha used to kiss him goodnight, now grotesquely swollen and tender. 18 months of loneliness had carved deep lines around his eyes, but nothing had prepared him for this moment when his body finally betrayed the grief he'd buried so deep. "Get infectious disease down here now," Dr. Coleman whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of medical equipment. What was growing inside this gentle widower's skull, and how much time did they have left? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Eugene "Gene" McCarthy had been just another face in the sea of wheelchairs and walkers at Sunset Manor, a modest assisted living facility on the outskirts of Austin, Texas. At 85, the Korean War veteran carried himself with the same ramrod posture that had served him well during his 3 tours of duty in the frozen hills of Chosin Reservoir. His silver hair was still thick, combed with military precision each morning, and his blue eyes held the clarity of a man who had seen the world's cruelties but chose to focus on its remaining kindnesses. The small apartment he called home was spartanly furnished. A single bed with hospital corners, a worn leather recliner facing a modest television, and a kitchen table where he ate his meals alone. Only one item broke the austere military aesthetic: a silver-framed wedding photograph showing a young soldier in dress uniform standing beside a radiant bride in white lace. Martha Elizabeth McCarthy had been 22 when that picture was taken in 1962, her smile bright enough to light up the darkest foxhole. Gene was 24, fresh from his second deployment, certain that surviving Korea meant he was invincible enough to promise this beautiful woman forever. They had been married 58 years when Alzheimer's began stealing Martha's memories like a thief in the night. Gene had fought that disease with the same determination he'd once shown against Chinese forces, refusing to surrender his wife to a sterile memory care facility. For 18 months, he had been her nurse, her protector, her constant companion, as she slowly forgot his name, their children, and finally, how to swallow. The day she died, Gene had held her hand and whispered the same promise he'd made on their wedding day. "Till death do us part, sweetheart." But not a moment longer. Now, 18 months after Martha's funeral, Gene moved through his days with the mechanical precision of a man following orders from a commanding officer who had long since abandoned the field. He ate breakfast at 7 sharp, watched the morning news until 9, then spent his afternoons in the facility's common room playing dominoes with other residents who understood the weight of outliving everyone they'd ever loved. His grandson Tommy called occasionally, brief, awkward conversations that left both men feeling more distant than before. The staff at Sunset Manor knew Gene as the quiet one, the gentleman who never complained about the lukewarm coffee or the way the air conditioning rattled through the night. Margaret O'Sullivan, the head nurse with 35 years of experience and an Irish accent that still carried traces of County Cork, had watched countless residents navigate the treacherous waters of grief. But there was something different about Gene McCarthy, a stillness that worried her, as if he was slowly disappearing from the inside out. What none of them knew was that Gene had been writing letters to Martha every single day since her funeral, storing them in a shoebox under his bed like love notes from a teenage suitor. In careful cursive handwriting, he would tell her about his day, ask for her advice about Tommy's troubles, and confess the growing ache in his chest that felt too large for his aging heart to contain. The first bump appeared on a Tuesday morning in late September, small as a pea and hard as a marble beneath the thin skin of Jean's scalp. He discovered it while performing his daily ritual of shaving, the same methodical routine he'd followed for 60 years. His fingers paused over the strange protrusion just above his left ear, and for a moment, he could almost hear Martha's voice echoing from their bathroom mirror. "Jean McCarthy, you're getting more lumps and bumps than an old country road." He smiled at the memory, pressing gently on the spot. It didn't hurt, not exactly, but there was a tenderness there that reminded him of the shrapnel wound he'd carried home from Incheon. "Just getting old, Martha," he whispered to his reflection, using the same tone he'd adopted during their final months together, when she would ask him the same question 17 times in an hour. "Nothing a tough old bird like me can't handle." For 3 days, Jean convinced himself it was nothing more than a sebaceous cyst, the kind of minor ailment that came with having survived 8.5 decades on Earth. He'd had them before, small, harmless bumps that Martha would fuss over until he agreed to see their family doctor. But Dr. Harrison had retired 5 years ago, and the new physician at the clinic always seemed rushed, always looking at his computer screen instead of his patients. Jean had stopped going for routine checkups after Martha died. What was the point of prolonging a life that felt increasingly empty? By Friday, 2 more bumps had appeared, forming a peculiar triangle pattern along his hairline. These were larger, more pronounced, and they brought with them a dull, persistent ache that made sleep elusive. Jean found himself touching them throughout the day, a nervous habit that reminded him of how Martha used to worry her wedding ring when she was anxious about something. The night sweats started that weekend, not the mild perspiration of an overheated room, but the kind of cold, clammy dampness that soaked through his pajamas and left him shivering despite the Texas heat. He began wearing a baseball cap to meals, pulling the brim low to hide the growing constellation of lumps that now dotted his scalp like some terrible topographical map. When Mrs. Henderson from apartment 4B commented on his new fashion choice, Jean deflected with a joke about his bad hair day. But the forced laughter felt hollow in his chest. He wasn't fooling anyone, least of all himself. The real crisis began on a Wednesday evening during the residents' weekly dinner gathering. Jean was pushing mashed potatoes around his plate, trying to ignore the throbbing in his head, when a wave of dizziness crashed over him like a rogue tide. The cafeteria sounds, clinking silverware, murmured conversations, the hum of the ice machine, suddenly became unbearably loud. His vision blurred, and for a terrifying moment he thought he saw Martha sitting across from him, her face wearing the confused expression she'd had during her worst Alzheimer's episodes. "Jean? Jean, honey, are you all right?" Margaret O'Sullivan's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she was standing right beside his chair. Her strong hands were on his shoulders, steadying him as the room tilted sideways. "I'm fine," he managed, the words coming out thick and slurred. "Just tired is all." But he wasn't fine, and they both knew it. Margaret helped him back to his apartment, her practiced eye taking inventory of his pale complexion, the way he favored his left side, the tremor in his hands that hadn't been there a month ago. When she asked about the baseball cap, Jean's fingers flew to his head in a protective gesture that told her everything she needed to know. "Jean McCarthy, you stubborn old fool," she said, her Irish accent thickening with concern. "When was the last time you saw a doctor?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications they were both afraid to acknowledge. Jean sank into his leather recliner, the one Martha had given him for their 40th anniversary, and finally removed the cap. Margaret's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. The bumps had multiplied, spreading across his scalp in an angry, irregular pattern. Some were small and hard, others larger and softer to the touch, but all of them shared the same inflamed, almost volcanic appearance. They looked like a landscape from another planet, alien and threatening against the familiar territory of an old man's head. "Sweet Jesus," Margaret whispered, crossing herself instinctively. In 35 years of nursing, she had seen cancer, infections, and diseases that had no names. But this was something entirely different, something that made her professional instincts scream warnings she couldn't quite articulate. Jean looked up at her with eyes that held too much resignation for a man who had survived war and loss, and the slow dissolution of everything he'd ever loved. "It's getting worse, isn't it, Maggie?" She nodded, unable to trust her voice. "We're calling an ambulance, Jean." Right now, the ambulance ride to St. David's Hospital felt like the longest 20 minutes of Jean's life, each bump in the road sending shockwaves of pain through his skull. The EMT, a young man barely older than Tommy, kept asking questions Jean couldn't focus on answering. His vision kept shifting between the present moment, fluorescent lights, medical equipment, the smell of antiseptic, and memories that seemed more real than reality itself. Martha in her yellow sundress, hanging laundry on the line behind their first house. Tommy, at age 7, missing his 2 front teeth, beaming as Jean taught him to throw a curveball in the backyard. Dr. Sarah Beth Coleman was finishing her 3rd consecutive 12-hour shift when Jean's case landed on her desk. At 38, she had seen enough medical mysteries to know the difference between routine and extraordinary. But nothing in her 15 years of emergency medicine had prepared her for what she found when she pulled back the examination room curtain. The bumps covering Jean's scalp defied easy categorization. They were too large and irregular for sebaceous cysts, too widespread for a simple infection, and too pronounced for any dermatological condition in her experience. "Mr. McCarthy," she said, her voice professionally calm despite the alarm bells ringing in her head, "I need to ask you some questions about your medical history. Have you traveled anywhere recently? Been exposed to any unusual chemicals or substances?" Jean's laugh came out as more of a wheeze. "Doc, the most exotic place I've been in the last 2 years is the Walmart pharmacy, unless you count the adventures of trying to remember which pill is which, Doctor." Coleman examined each bump with the methodical precision of a cartographer mapping uncharted territory. Some were firm and immobile, others softer and slightly warm to the touch. The largest one, positioned just above his right ear, had begun to take on a reddish hue that suggested inflammation or possible infection. When she pressed gently around its perimeter, Jean winced and gripped the examination table's metal rail so hard his knuckles went white. "On a scale of 1 to 10, Mr. McCarthy, how would you rate your pain?" "Depends," Jean replied, his voice strained. "Are we talking about the kind of pain that keeps you awake at night, or the kind that makes you wonder if this is how it all ends?" The honesty in his answer caught Dr. Coleman off guard. In her experience, elderly patients either downplayed their symptoms or dramatized them. Jean's matter-of-fact assessment of his own mortality spoke to a kind of courage she rarely encountered. She found herself studying his face, the weathered lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw that suggested a man accustomed to enduring whatever life threw at him. "Let's start with some basic tests," she said, making notes in his chart. "Blood work, imaging, and I'd like to do a small biopsy on one of the larger lesions." The word biopsy hung in the air like a death sentence. Jean had heard it before during Martha's illness, when doctors had used clinical terms to discuss the tumors growing in her brain like unwelcome house guests. He nodded, understanding that this was the moment when his life officially became divided into before and after, before the bumps and whatever came next. While they waited for the test results, Margaret O'Sullivan arrived at the hospital, still wearing her Sunset Manor uniform and carrying a small overnight bag she'd packed with Jean's essentials. Her presence transformed the sterile examination room into something more human, more bearable. She had called Tommy from the ambulance, leaving a voicemail that was equal parts information and plea. "Your grandfather is in the hospital, Tommy Ray McCarthy, St. David's Emergency. He needs you here. We all need you here." Tommy arrived 3 hours later looking like he'd driven straight through from wherever he'd been without stopping to change clothes or shave. His work boots were caked with dried mud, his flannel shirt bore the stains of honest labor, and his eyes held the particular kind of exhaustion that came from working multiple jobs just to stay afloat. When he saw Jean propped up in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines and monitors, something in his carefully constructed adult facade crumbled. "Jesus, Grandpa, why didn't you call me sooner?" Jean's response was quieter than Tommy expected. "Didn't want to worry you, son. Figured you had enough on your plate without adding an old man's problems to the mix." The conversation that followed was stilted, full of the careful politeness that had characterized their relationship since Tommy's father died in Iraq 15 years earlier. They were two men who loved each other deeply, but had never learned how to express it without Martha serving as translator and mediator. She had been the emotional center of their small family, the one who remembered birthdays and insisted on holiday gatherings and called Tommy every Sunday evening to check on his life. Dr. Coleman returned with preliminary blood work results that raised more questions than they answered. Jean's white blood cell count was elevated, suggesting his body was fighting some kind of infection. But the inflammatory markers were inconsistent with any standard bacterial or viral pathogen. His liver enzymes were slightly elevated, and there were trace amounts of proteins in his blood that shouldn't have been there. "Mr. McCarthy, I'm going to be honest with you," she said, pulling up a chair so she could speak to him at eye level. "We're seeing some unusual findings that require more specialized testing. I'd like to keep you here overnight for observation and bring in our infectious disease specialist in the morning." The mention of overnight stay brought a new concern to the forefront. Jean had been living on Social Security and a modest military pension since Martha died, and even with Medicare, hospital stays were financially devastating. The irony wasn't lost on him that he might die from worry about the cost of trying to stay alive. Tommy seemed to read his grandfather's thoughts. "Don't even think about the money, Grandpa. We'll figure it out." But Jean knew better than most how quickly medical bills could consume a lifetime of savings. He had watched Martha's Alzheimer's treatment drain their retirement fund, forcing them to mortgage the house they'd owned free and clear for 30 years. The final 18 months of her life had cost more than the first 50 years of their marriage combined. As evening settled over the hospital, Jean found himself staring out the window at the Austin skyline, thinking about all the nights he and Martha had watched the sunset from their front porch. She used to say that every sunset was God's way of reminding them that something beautiful could come from ending, that even the close of day could be gorgeous if you paid attention to the colors. The bumps on his head throbbed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder that something fundamental had changed in his carefully ordered world. But for the first time in 18 months, he wasn't entirely alone. Tommy had fallen asleep in the uncomfortable hospital chair, his long legs stretched out awkwardly, his breathing deep and steady. It was the first time Jean had seen his grandson truly rest in years. Dr. Marcus Webb arrived at St. David's Hospital on Thursday morning with the kind of reputation that preceded him through hospital corridors like a medical legend. As the head of infectious diseases at the University of Texas Medical Center, he had spent 25 years hunting down mysterious illnesses that baffled other physicians. His specialty was the impossible cases, the tropical diseases that somehow found their way to Texas, the bacterial infections that resisted every known antibiotic, the viral outbreaks that threatened to become epidemics. When Dr. Coleman called him about Jean's case, describing bumps that defied classification and test results that made no medical sense, Webb cleared his morning schedule without hesitation. His first examination of Jean lasted nearly 2 hours, during which he photographed each lesion from multiple angles, measured their dimensions with digital calipers, and took detailed notes about their texture, temperature, and apparent growth patterns. Jean endured the scrutiny with military stoicism, though Tommy could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his grandfather's face. The bumps had continued to multiply overnight, and several of the larger ones had developed a disturbing translucent quality, as if something was moving beneath the surface. "In 40 years of medicine," Dr. Webb told Dr. Coleman privately, "I've never encountered anything quite like this. The tissue samples we took yesterday show cellular activity that's consistent with rapid growth, but the structure is unlike any tumor or cyst I've studied. It's almost as if his body is creating these formations in response to some kind of systemic stress." While the medical team puzzled over test results and consulted with specialists across the country, Tommy began to piece together the hidden narrative of his grandfather's life since Martha's death. A conversation with Margaret O'Sullivan revealed that Jean had been steadily losing weight over the past year, often skipping meals and forgetting to take his prescribed medications. The Sunset Manor staff had noticed his increasing isolation, the way he'd stopped participating in group activities and spent most of his time alone in his room. "Your grandfather is a proud man," Margaret explained as they sat in the hospital cafeteria, her Irish accent softening with sympathy. "Too proud to admit he's struggling, too stubborn to ask for help. He's been grieving that woman for 18 months, but he's been doing it alone because he thinks that's what men of his generation are supposed to do." Tommy pushed his untouched sandwich around his plate, guilt gnawing at him like a physical pain. He had called Jean every few weeks, brief conversations that never went beyond surface pleasantries. "How are you feeling?" "Fine." "How's the weather?" "Hot." "Need anything?" "No, I'm getting along just fine." Looking back, Tommy realized that his grandfather had been sending distress signals for months, but they had been coded in the language of masculine stoicism that neither man knew how to translate. The revelation about Martha's final years came during Tommy's second night at the hospital, when Jean's pain medication made him unusually talkative. In halting sentences punctuated by long pauses, he began to describe the 18 months of caregiving that had consumed the end of his marriage. Martha's Alzheimer's had progressed rapidly, stealing her memories in cruel increments until she no longer recognized the man who had loved her for nearly 6 decades. "She stopped knowing my name first," Jean said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then she forgot we were married. By the end, she thought I was some stranger who kept trying to touch her, keep her safe. The worst part wasn't losing her. It was watching her lose herself, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but fear in her eyes when she looked at me." Jean had refused to place Martha in a memory care facility, despite the recommendations of doctors and social workers who warned him about the physical and emotional toll of round-the-clock caregiving. He had bathed her, fed her, and stayed awake for nights on end when her confusion made sleep impossible. He had learned to administer medications, change adult diapers, and speak to his wife in the simple, soothing tones usually reserved for frightened children. "And I promised her in sickness and in health," he continued, his fingers unconsciously touching the wedding ring he still wore. "Didn't seem right to break that promise just because the sickness got harder than I expected." Tommy listened with growing horror and admiration as his grandfather described the systematic destruction of his own health in service of Martha's dignity. Jean had lost 40 pounds during those 18 months, developed chronic insomnia, and ignored his own medical needs because Martha required constant supervision. When she finally died, peacefully in her sleep with Jean holding her hand, he had been so depleted that he barely remembered the funeral arrangements or the weeks that followed. Dr. Coleman began to suspect that Jean's mysterious condition might be connected to the extreme physical and emotional stress he had endured. She consulted with colleagues in psychosomatic medicine, specialists who studied the complex relationship between mental anguish and physical symptoms. The human body, they explained, could manifest psychological trauma in unexpected ways: chronic pain without apparent cause, autoimmune disorders triggered by grief, even skin conditions that reflected internal emotional states. Think of it as your grandfather's body finally having permission to break down, one specialist explained to Tommy during a video consultation. For 18 months, he forced himself to stay strong because someone else depended on him. Now that the immediate crisis is over, his system is essentially collapsing from delayed exhaustion. The financial reality of Jean's hospitalization became increasingly pressing as the days stretched into a week. Even with Medicare coverage, the specialized testing, consultations, and extended stay were generating bills that would quickly exceed Jean's modest savings. Tommy watched his grandfather's anxiety increase each time a new specialist appeared, knowing that Jean was calculating the cost of every additional test and procedure. "Maybe it's time to think about going home," Jean suggested on Friday evening, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm feeling a bit better, and I know you need to get back to work." Tommy had been dreading this conversation because it would require him to reveal the truth about his own circumstances. For the past 6 months, he had been living in his pickup truck, moving from one construction site to another, picking up day labor when he could find it. The economic downturn had hit the building trades especially hard, and steady work had become increasingly scarce. He had been too ashamed to tell Jean about his eviction, too proud to ask for help from an 85-year-old man who was struggling with his own problems. "Actually, Grandpa, I don't have anywhere else to be right now," Tommy said, the admission feeling like swallowing glass. "I lost my apartment a while back. Been sort of figuring things out." The silence that followed was filled with all the conversations they should have had months earlier. Jean's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that looked like relief. Here was a problem he could actually solve, a way to be useful again after months of feeling like a burden on everyone around him. "Well then," Jean said, his voice gaining strength for the first time in days, "I guess we'll figure things out together." Dr. Webb's breakthrough came on Saturday morning when he received results from a specialized lab in Atlanta that had analyzed Jean's tissue samples at the cellular level. The bumps weren't tumors or infections in any traditional sense. They were the physical manifestation of a condition called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, also known as broken heart syndrome. The extreme emotional stress of prolonged caregiving, combined with the acute grief of losing Martha, had literally begun to reshape Jean's cardiovascular system. The bumps were subcutaneous edema, fluid accumulation caused by his heart's inability to pump efficiently. "It's actually more common than we used to think," Dr. Webb explained to the assembled family and medical team. "Severe emotional trauma can trigger physical changes that mimic heart attacks, strokes, even cancer. Your grandfather's body has been in crisis mode for almost 2 years. These bumps are essentially pressure release valves, his system's way of trying to cope with stress that has nowhere else to go." The diagnosis brought both relief and new concerns. Broken heart syndrome was treatable, but it required addressing both the physical symptoms and the underlying emotional trauma that had caused them. Jean would need cardiac medications to help his heart heal, but he would also need grief counseling and social support to prevent the condition from recurring. Margaret O'Sullivan had been quietly working behind the scenes, contacting veterans organizations and social services to help navigate the financial aspects of Jean's care. Her decades of nursing experience had taught her that medical problems were rarely just medical. They were tangled up with economics, family dynamics, and social systems that often failed the people who needed them most. "There are programs for veterans," she explained to Tommy, her practical Irish nature cutting through the bureaucratic complexity. Your grandfather served his country, and now his country needs to serve him. It won't cover everything, but it's a start. As Jean's physical condition began to stabilize with proper treatment, the emotional work of healing began in earnest. Dr. Coleman arranged for a grief counselor to visit, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Patricia Reeves who specialized in working with elderly patients facing complex loss. Her first session with Jean was difficult, filled with long silences and carefully controlled tears that spoke to decades of practiced emotional restraint. "Grief isn't something you get over," Dr. Reeves told him during their second meeting. "It's something you learn to carry differently. Right now, you're trying to carry Martha's memory and your guilt about surviving her all by yourself. That's too much weight for any one person, especially someone whose body is already telling him to slow down." The conversation that emerged over the following days revealed the depth of Jean's survivor's guilt. He felt responsible for Martha's suffering, convinced that a better husband would have found a way to cure her disease or at least ease her confusion. He felt guilty for the moments when he had lost patience with her repetitive questions, for the times he had fantasized about escaping to somewhere quiet and peaceful, for the relief he had felt when she finally stopped fighting and slipped away. Tommy found himself becoming his grandfather's advocate and confidant in ways he had never expected. The crisis had stripped away the careful politeness that had characterized their relationship, leaving room for honest conversations about fear, regret, and the complicated nature of love in the face of impossible circumstances. For the first time since his father's death, Tommy felt useful, needed in a way that had nothing to do with his ability to earn money or fix things with his hands. The crisis began at 3:17 a.m. on Tuesday morning when Jean's heart monitor started screaming through the hospital corridors like a banshee announcing death's arrival. Tommy jerked awake in the uncomfortable visitor's chair where he'd been keeping vigil, immediately alert despite days of broken sleep. The cardiac alarm had a specific pitch that every hospital regular learned to recognize, not the steady beeping of normal irregularities, but the frantic, urgent shriek that meant someone was fighting for their life. Dr. Coleman reached Jean's room first, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor as she ran from the nurses' station. Behind her came a stream of medical personnel, nurses wheeling crash carts, respiratory therapists carrying oxygen equipment, and residents whose young faces reflected the controlled panic that emergency medicine demanded. Jean's body was rigid on the hospital bed, his back arched in an unnatural position as his heart struggled to maintain a rhythm that would keep him alive. "V-fib," Dr. Coleman announced, reading the erratic lines dancing across the cardiac monitor. "Ventricular fibrillation, the heart's electrical system misfiring so catastrophically that the muscle could no longer pump blood effectively. Without immediate intervention, brain death would occur within minutes. Get me the paddles. Clear the room of non-essential personnel." Tommy found himself pushed against the wall, watching helplessly as the medical team worked with choreographed precision to save his grandfather's life. The defibrillator charged with a high-pitched whine that seemed to last forever, followed by the sharp crack of electricity and Jean's body jerking against the restraints like a marionette controlled by an invisible hand. The first shock failed to restore normal rhythm. So did the second. "Come on, Jean," Margaret O'Sullivan whispered from her position near the head of the bed, her Irish accent thick with emotion. "Don't you dare give up on us now, you stubborn old soldier." The third shock finally caught Jean's heart at the right moment in its chaotic cycle, and the monitor settled into the steady, blessed rhythm of a normal heartbeat. But the victory was temporary. Dr. Coleman's examination revealed that Jean's condition had deteriorated significantly overnight. The bumps on his scalp had darkened to an angry purple, and several had begun to weep a clear fluid that spoke to serious internal pressure. His blood pressure was dangerously low, his kidneys were showing signs of stress, and his white blood cell count had spiked to levels that suggested his body was fighting a war it couldn't win. "We need to have a serious conversation," Dr. Coleman told Tommy in the hallway outside Jean's room. Her voice carried the careful neutrality that medical professionals used when delivering news that families weren't prepared to hear. "Your grandfather's heart is failing. The stress cardiomyopathy has progressed to the point where his cardiac muscle is severely weakened. We're looking at the possibility of complete heart failure within the next 48 hours. The words hit Tommy like physical blows. Complete heart failure. 48 hours. The clinical language couldn't disguise what Dr. Coleman was really saying. His grandfather was dying, and there was very little they could do to stop it. Tommy's legs suddenly felt unsteady, and he leaned against the hospital wall for support, overwhelmed by the realization that he was about to lose the last stable relationship in his life. "What are our options?" he managed to ask, though part of him dreaded the answer. Dr. Coleman explained the medical realities with compassionate honesty. Gene's age and overall health made him a poor candidate for aggressive interventions like heart surgery or mechanical circulatory support. They could continue treating his symptoms with medications, but the underlying condition, the broken heart syndrome triggered by profound grief, wasn't something that could be fixed with procedures or pills. It required healing of a different kind, the sort that happened in the realm of the spirit rather than the body. "The most important thing now is making sure he's comfortable and that he knows he's not alone," she said. "Sometimes the best medicine we can offer is simply being present." Tommy returned to Jean's room to find his grandfather awake and surprisingly lucid despite the medical crisis. The near-death experience seemed to have brought a strange clarity to Jean's eyes, as if brushing against mortality had burned away everything except what truly mattered. He reached for Tommy's hand with fingers that trembled but still carried surprising strength. "I need to tell you some things," Jean said, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd briefly inserted during the resuscitation. "Things I should have said a long time ago." What followed was the conversation they should have had years earlier, filled with admissions and apologies that had been buried under layers of masculine stoicism and family dysfunction. Jean spoke about his failures as a father and grandfather, the emotional distance he'd maintained because his own father had taught him that real men didn't discuss feelings, the way he'd thrown himself into work after returning from Korea instead of dealing with what he'd seen and done there. "Your daddy was a better man than I ever was," Jean continued, his eyes filling with tears he'd held back for decades. "He knew how to say I love you without it sounding like a foreign language. I never learned that trick. But I need you to know, Tommy Ray, I've been proud of you every single day of your life, even when I was too much of a fool to say it out loud." Tommy found himself crying for the first time since his father's funeral, all the grief and anger and loneliness of the past 15 years pouring out in ugly, cathartic sobs. He had spent so many years feeling like a disappointment, convinced that his struggles with employment and housing and the general mess of his adult life had somehow dishonored his grandfather's memory of his father. To learn that Jean had been proud of him all along felt like receiving an unexpected inheritance. The next 24 hours passed in a surreal blur of medical procedures and family conversations that felt both urgent and timeless. Jean's condition continued to deteriorate, but his mental clarity remained sharp, as if his mind was determined to accomplish important business before his body gave up entirely. He asked Tommy to retrieve a shoebox from under his bed at Sunset Manor, the one containing the letters he'd written to Martha since her death. Reading those letters together became their shared vigil, a way of honoring Martha's memory while acknowledging the depth of Jean's grief. The letters revealed a man who had been slowly drowning in loneliness, who had continued loving his wife with such intensity that it was literally breaking his heart. Some entries were mundane reports about his daily activities. Others were passionate love letters that could have been written by a young soldier separated from his bride by war. "I kept writing to her because it was the only way I knew how to stay married," Jean explained. 60 years of telling that woman about my day. I didn't know how to stop just because she wasn't there to answer back. Margaret O'Sullivan spent Wednesday evening coordinating with the hospital's social services department to ensure that Jean's end-of-life wishes would be respected. She had seen too many families torn apart by medical decisions made in crisis, and she was determined that Jean would have the peaceful death he deserved. The bureaucratic battles over insurance coverage and treatment options seemed suddenly irrelevant when measured against the simple human need for dignity in dying. Dr. Coleman found herself spending more time in Jean's room than medical necessity required. Something about his case had touched her in ways that challenged her professional detachment. Perhaps it was the way he faced his mortality with such quiet courage, or the obvious love between grandfather and grandson that had been obscured by years of miscommunication. She had entered medicine to save lives, but Jean was teaching her that sometimes the most important healing happened when doctors stopped trying to cure and started simply witnessing. "Doc," Jean said during one of her visits, "I want you to know that what you've done here, it matters. Not just the medical stuff, though that's been important too, but the way you've treated us like people instead of problems to solve. That's rarer than it ought to be." Thursday morning brought what appeared to be Jean's final crisis. His heart rate became increasingly irregular, his breathing grew shallow and labored, and the monitors surrounding his bed began their ominous chorus of alarms. Tommy held his grandfather's hand and sang the old country songs that Jean had taught him as a child, his voice breaking on lyrics about love and loss and the promise of better days ahead. Margaret stood at the foot of the bed, her lips moving in silent prayers that bridged the gap between medical science and ancient hope. Dr. Coleman checked Jean's vital signs with growing concern. His blood pressure was barely detectable, his oxygen levels were dropping despite supplemental support, and his cardiac rhythm showed the irregular patterns that typically preceded complete heart failure. By every medical indicator, Jean McCarthy was dying. She had seen enough deaths to recognize the signs, the particular pallor that came with systemic shutdown, the way breathing became increasingly effortful, the gradual withdrawal from consciousness that marked the transition from living to dying. But something in Jean's eyes suggested that he wasn't quite ready to surrender. Even as his body failed, there was a stubborn spark of determination that reminded everyone in the room why he had survived war, poverty, and the slow agony of watching his wife disappear into dementia. He was fighting for something. Perhaps for more time with Tommy, perhaps for the chance to complete some unfinished emotional business, or perhaps simply because giving up had never been in his nature. At 2:43 a.m. on Friday morning, the monitors surrounding Jean's bed fell silent in a way that made Tommy's blood freeze in his veins. Not the frantic beeping of crisis, but the terrible, flat-line silence that meant his grandfather's heart had stopped beating entirely. The absence of sound was more terrifying than any alarm, a digital announcement that 85 years of life had suddenly, irrevocably ended. Dr. Coleman appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the silence, her face grim with the knowledge that this moment had been approaching for days. She moved quickly to Jean's bedside, checking for pulse, pupil response, any sign that life remained in the still form beneath the hospital blankets. Tommy watched in numb horror as she began chest compressions, her hands pressing rhythmically against his grandfather's ribs in a desperate attempt to restart a heart that had simply given up. "How long has he been down?" she asked Margaret, who had arrived moments behind her. "Less than a minute," Margaret replied, though her voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed too many such scenes over her decades of nursing. "I was checking on him when the monitors went flat." The next 10 minutes felt like hours as the medical team worked with mechanical precision to bring Gene back from the edge of death. Epinephrine injected directly into his bloodstream. The defibrillator charging and discharging with its familiar electrical crack. More chest compressions, each one forcing oxygenated blood through vessels that were no longer receiving signals from a functioning heart. Tommy stood pressed against the wall, watching strangers fight for his grandfather's life while feeling utterly powerless to help. "We've got a rhythm," Dr. Coleman announced after what felt like an eternity, and the monitors grudgingly began their steady beeping once again. But even Tommy could see that this victory was Pyrrhic. Gene's color remained ashen, his breathing shallow and irregular despite the oxygen mask covering his face. The man who had survived the frozen hell of the Korean War, who had carried wounded comrades through enemy fire, who had spent 18 months caring for a wife who no longer recognized him, was finally losing the most important battle of his life. "Tommy," Gene whispered when consciousness briefly returned, his voice so weak that his grandson had to lean close to hear. "I need to tell you about the money." What followed was a confession that shattered everything Tommy thought he understood about their family's financial situation. For the past 6 months, Gene had been quietly transferring money from his savings account to cover Tommy's rent, utilities, and basic expenses. He had discovered Tommy's eviction notice during a visit months earlier and had been secretly paying his landlord to prevent the foreclosure. When that arrangement finally collapsed, Gene had continued sending money to a post office box, not knowing that Tommy was living in his truck and unable to access the funds. "I've got about 18,000 left," Gene continued, each word requiring tremendous effort. "It's yours now, all of it. But promise me something. Use it to get your life back together. Get an apartment. Go back to school if you want. Just don't waste it on feeling sorry for yourself." Tommy felt his world tilting sideways as the implications sank in. His grandfather, living on a fixed income in a modest assisted living facility, had been quietly bankrupting himself to help a grandson who had been too proud to ask for assistance. The money that could have been used for better medical care, for private nursing, for any number of comforts that would have improved Gene's quality of life, had instead been sacrificed to preserve Tommy's dignity. "Grandpa, I didn't know," Tommy managed, his voice breaking. "If I had known you were—" "That's exactly why I didn't tell you," Gene interrupted with a ghost of his old smile. "You're too much like me, son. Too stubborn to accept help when you need it most. But sometimes being strong means letting other people take care of you." The conversation was interrupted by another cardiac episode, this one even more severe than the previous night's crisis. Gene's heart went into ventricular tachycardia, a racing rhythm that prevented effective pumping and sent his blood pressure plummeting. The medical team responded with practiced urgency, but Tommy could see the growing concern in their faces. Each episode was weakening Gene's already compromised cardiovascular system, and his body was running out of reserves to fight back. Dr. Coleman took Tommy aside after they had stabilized Gene once again, her expression carrying the gravity of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. "I need you to understand that we're reaching the limits of what medical intervention can accomplish," she said. "Your grandfather's heart has been damaged beyond our ability to repair. We can continue with aggressive treatment, but at this point we're prolonging the dying process rather than preserving life." The choice she was asking Tommy to make felt impossible. Continue fighting with medications and procedures that offered minimal hope but guaranteed suffering, or shift to comfort care that would allow Gene to die peacefully, but certainly It was the kind of decision that no 34-year-old should have to make about the man who had raised him, the kind of choice that would define the rest of his life regardless of which option he chose. "What would he want?" Tommy asked, though he already knew the answer. "In my experience," Dr. Coleman replied gently, "people like your grandfather usually want to go out on their own terms, with dignity, surrounded by people who love them." Tommy returned to Jean's room to find his grandfather awake and surprisingly alert, as if some internal reserve of strength had been activated by proximity to death. The bumps on his scalp had begun to recede slightly, their angry inflammation giving way to a strange, almost peaceful appearance. It was as if Jean's body was finally beginning to relax after months of fighting battles it couldn't win. "I can see it in your face," Jean said before Tommy could speak. "The doc told you it's time to stop fighting." Tommy nodded, unable to trust his voice. "Good," Jean continued, reaching for his grandson's hand. "I'm tired, son. More tired than I've ever been in my life. I've been holding on because I was worried about leaving you alone, but I think maybe you're going to be okay after all." What followed was the most honest conversation of Tommy's life, a raw exchange of fears and regrets and love that had been building between them for decades. Jean spoke about his pride in watching Tommy overcome his struggles with addiction, about his faith that his grandson would find his way to a meaningful life, about his excitement at the prospect of seeing Martha again. Tommy talked about his gratitude for the man who had stepped in when his father died, about his determination to honor Jean's memory by building something worthwhile with the second chance he'd been given. "There's something else," Jean said as the conversation wound down. "In my room at Sunset Manor, there's a folder in my desk drawer. It's got information about your daddy, letters he wrote from Iraq, pictures I never showed you, some things he wanted you to have when you were older. I kept meaning to give them to you, but the time never seemed right." The revelation that there were still undiscovered pieces of his father's legacy waiting for him felt like receiving an unexpected gift. Tommy had always felt disconnected from the man who died when he was 19, struggling to remember details about someone who had become more myth than memory over the years. The promise of letters and photographs offered the possibility of knowing his father as an adult, of understanding the man behind the uniform and the heroic stories. As Friday morning gave way to afternoon, Jean's condition continued its inexorable decline. His breathing became increasingly labored, his periods of consciousness grew shorter and more confused, and the monitors showed the telltale signs of multiple organ systems beginning to shut down. Margaret arranged for a chaplain to visit, a kind-faced man who offered prayers and comfort without pushing any particular religious agenda. But perhaps the most important visitor was Dr. Patricia Reeves, the grief counselor who had been working with Jean throughout his hospitalization. She brought with her a perspective that transcended medical intervention, helping both Tommy and Jean understand that death could be approached as a final act of living rather than simply the absence of life. "Dying well is an art," she explained to Tommy. "Your grandfather has been practicing for it his whole life, in the way he loved your grandmother, in the way he served his country, in the way he raised you after your father died. This is just the final expression of a life well lived." Saturday morning brought an unexpected visitor who would change everything Tommy thought he understood about his grandfather's final days. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the University of Texas Southwestern arrived at Jean's bedside carrying a thick manila folder and wearing the expression of someone who had discovered something extraordinary. As a leading researcher in psychocardiology, the study of how emotional states affect heart function, she had been following Jean's case with intense professional interest since Dr. Coleman had contacted her earlier in the week. "Mr. McCarthy," she said, addressing Jean directly despite his weakened state, I believe we've misunderstood what's happening to your body. What we initially diagnosed as terminal heart failure may actually be something entirely different and potentially reversible. Doctor Rodriguez explained that Jean's condition represented one of the most severe cases of stress-induced cardiomyopathy ever documented in medical literature. The broken heart syndrome had been triggered not just by Martha's death, but by the compounding trauma of 18 months of exhaustive caregiving, followed by acute grief and social isolation. His body had essentially been in a state of chronic emergency for nearly 2 years, flooding his system with stress hormones that eventually began to damage his cardiac muscle. But here's what we didn't understand until now, she continued, spreading medical charts across the bedside table. The bumps on your scalp weren't random symptoms. They were your body's way of trying to protect your heart. When stress hormones couldn't be processed normally through your cardiovascular system, your body created alternative pathways. Those subcutaneous formations were essentially overflow valves, preventing even more serious cardiac damage. Tommy listened with growing amazement as Dr. Rodriguez described how Jean's body had been fighting to keep him alive in ways that medical science was only beginning to understand. The seemingly grotesque bumps that had alarmed everyone were actually evidence of an incredibly sophisticated biological response to psychological trauma. Jean's physiology had been adapting, evolving, trying to find ways to survive emotional pain that would have killed most people outright. "What does this mean for his treatment?" Tommy asked, hardly daring to hope. "It means that if we can address the underlying emotional trauma that triggered this response, your grandfather's heart might be able to heal itself," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "The human body has remarkable recuperative powers when the source of stress is removed or properly processed." The first revelation came when Dr. Rodriguez conducted a detailed interview about Jean's caregiving experience with Martha. Through careful questioning, she uncovered a story that was even more heartbreaking than Tommy had imagined. Jean hadn't just been caring for his wife during her final 18 months. He had been essentially living in a state of anticipatory grief, watching the woman he loved disappear incrementally while trying to maintain hope that she might somehow return to him. "I used to read to her every night," Jean confessed, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "The same romance novel we'd read together on our honeymoon. For the first few months, she would sometimes smile when I got to the good parts, like she remembered. But toward the end, she would just stare at me like I was a stranger who had broken into her house." The emotional weight of this daily ritual, maintaining connection with someone who no longer existed in any recognizable form, had created a psychological burden that few people could have survived. Jean had essentially been grieving Martha's death for months before she actually died, then grieving the loss of their shared memories, their plans for the future, and his own identity as a husband and protector. But the most shocking revelation came when Dr. Rodriguez asked about Jean's support system during those difficult months. Through gentle probing, she discovered that Jean had been hiding the severity of Martha's condition from everyone, including Tommy, because he was ashamed of his inability to cure her disease through sheer force of will and devotion. "I kept thinking that if I just loved her hard enough, if I just tried harder, maybe she'd come back to me," Jean admitted. "When that didn't work, I figured it was because I wasn't the husband she deserved, so I stopped telling people how bad it really was. Didn't want them to know I was failing her." This confession opened the floodgates to a deeper truth that had been poisoning Jean's heart for nearly 2 years. He hadn't just been grieving Martha's death, he had been carrying crushing guilt about his perceived failures as her caregiver. Every moment of impatience during her illness, every time he had fantasized about escaping to a quiet place where no one needed him, every instant of relief he felt when she finally stopped fighting, had been transformed in his mind into evidence of his inadequacy as a husband. Tommy found himself crying again, but this time the tears were mixed with anger at the impossible standards his grandfather had set for himself. Gene had sacrificed his health, his savings, and his emotional well-being to provide Martha with care that most professional facilities couldn't match, yet he considered himself a failure because love alone couldn't cure Alzheimer's disease. "Grandpa, you didn't fail her," Tommy said, gripping Jean's hand tightly. "You gave her everything you had. You kept her safe and loved until the very end. That's not failure, that's heroism." Dr. Rodriguez had been taking detailed notes throughout this conversation, recognizing that they were witnessing something rare in medical practice, the moment when a patient's psychological defenses finally crumbled enough to allow real healing to begin. She had seen similar cases where the simple act of confession, of speaking aloud the guilt and shame that had been eating away at someone's soul, could trigger remarkable physical improvements. "Jean," she said gently, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. Everything that happened to Martha was caused by a disease that no amount of love could cure. The fact that you cared for her at home for 18 months, that you maintained her dignity and kept her safe, that you were holding her hand when she died peacefully. That's not failure. That's the most successful caregiving story I've ever heard." The effect of these words on Gene was immediate and visible. His breathing, which had been shallow and labored for days, seemed to deepen slightly. The tension that had been etched into every line of his face began to soften. It was as if someone had finally given him permission to stop carrying a burden that had been crushing him for nearly 2 years. But the most dramatic revelation was yet to come. Dr. Rodriguez had requested Gene's complete medical records from the Veterans Administration, including psychological evaluations that had been conducted during his military service in Korea. What she discovered explained so much about his response to Martha's illness that it felt like solving a decades-old mystery. Gene had been diagnosed with what was then called combat fatigue, but would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder following a particularly brutal battle at Heartbreak Ridge in 1951. His unit had been pinned down for 3 days, watching friends die while being unable to help them or even retrieve their bodies for proper burial. The psychological evaluation noted that Gene had developed an excessive sense of responsibility for others' welfare and a pathological need to prevent loss through personal sacrifice. "Do you see the pattern?" Dr. Rodriguez asked Tommy privately. "Your grandfather has been trying to save people his entire life because he couldn't save his fellow soldiers in Korea." Martha's illness triggered the same psychological response that he experienced during combat, the desperate belief that if he just tried harder, sacrificed more, he could prevent loss from occurring. This understanding reframed everything about Gene's recent medical crisis. His broken heart syndrome wasn't just about grief, it was about the reactivation of trauma responses that had been dormant for 70 years. The bumps on his scalp, the cardiac irregularities, the physical deterioration were all manifestations of a wounded soldier's psyche finally collapsing under the weight of a mission he could never complete. The second major breakthrough came when Margaret O'Sullivan arrived with a surprise that no one had anticipated. She had spent the morning at Sunset Manor collecting Gene's personal belongings as requested, but she had discovered something in his room that changed everyone's understanding of his emotional state. Hidden in the back of his closet behind his carefully pressed shirts and military dress uniform, she had found 17 handwritten letters addressed to Tommy that had never been sent. These letters, written over the course of the past year, revealed a grandfather's desperate desire to reconnect with his grandson, but complete inability to find the words that would bridge the gap between them. Gene had written about his pride in Tommy's sobriety, his worry about Tommy's unemployment, his regret about the emotional distance that had grown between them since his father's death. He had poured his heart onto paper dozens of times, but had never found the courage to send a single letter. "I kept trying to write something that would help," Gene explained when Margaret read excerpts aloud. but everything I put down sounded like preaching or complaining or making excuses. I didn't want to be another burden on your shoulders." Tommy listened to his grandfather's unspoken words with a mixture of heartbreak and wonder. All this time, while he had been feeling isolated and forgotten, Jean had been struggling with the same feelings of disconnection. They had been orbiting around each other like distant planets, each assuming the other didn't want closer contact. The most powerful letter was the one Jean had written on the anniversary of Martha's death, a raw expression of grief and loneliness that he had never shown to another living soul. In it, he described sitting alone in his room, holding her photograph and trying to remember the sound of her laughter. He wrote about the physical pain of missing someone, the way grief could feel like carrying a stone in your chest that grew heavier each day. "I don't know how to be a widower," he had written. "I only ever learned how to be Martha's husband. Without her, I feel like half a person walking around pretending to be whole." As these emotional revelations continued throughout Saturday afternoon, something remarkable began to happen to Jean's physical condition. His heart rhythm, which had been erratic for days, began to stabilize. His blood pressure improved. The angry inflammation in the bumps on his scalp visibly decreased. It was as if the simple act of being fully known and understood by the people who loved him was triggering his body's natural healing mechanisms. Dr. Rodriguez documented these changes with the excitement of a researcher witnessing medical history in the making. Jean's case was demonstrating the profound connection between emotional healing and physical recovery in ways that could revolutionize how doctors approached stress-related illness. The implications extended far beyond one elderly veteran's struggle with grief. They suggested new treatment approaches for thousands of patients whose physical symptoms had psychological roots. "What we're seeing here," she explained to the assembled medical team, "is evidence that the human heart can literally heal itself when the emotional conditions are right. Jean's cardiovascular system is responding to love and understanding as powerfully as it would respond to any medication we could prescribe." 3 months later, Eugene McCarthy stood in the rose garden behind Sunset Manor, his weathered hands steady as he pruned the Martha Washington climbing roses that had been his wife's pride and joy. The mysterious bumps that had once covered his scalp were nothing more than faint pink scars, barely visible beneath his silver hair. His heart, according to Dr. Rodriguez's latest tests, showed remarkable improvement. Not completely healed, but functioning well enough to support a man who had rediscovered reasons to keep living. Tommy knelt beside him, carefully following his grandfather's instructions on proper pruning technique. At 34, he was finally learning the patience that gardening required, the faith in future blooms that kept you working through seasons of apparent dormancy. His calloused hands, once skilled only in the rough work of construction, were developing the gentler touch needed to coax beauty from stubborn earth. "Your grandmother always said these roses were like marriage," Jean explained, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "Some years they bloom like crazy, covering the whole trellis with flowers so beautiful it takes your breath away. Other years you wonder if they're ever going to bloom again. But if you keep taking care of them, keep pruning away the dead wood and feeding the roots, they'll surprise you with something worth waiting for." The transformation in both men had been gradual but unmistakable. Jean's recovery had progressed in stages. First the stabilization of his heart rhythm, then the slow disappearance of the subcutaneous bumps. Finally, the return of appetite and energy that allowed him to reclaim small but meaningful pieces of his former life. Dr. Rodriguez had documented his case for the New England Journal of Medicine, calling it the most dramatic example of stress-induced cardiomyopathy reversal in medical literature. Tommy's healing had been less dramatic, but equally profound. The $18,000 Jean had saved for him became the foundation for a new beginning. He had rented a small apartment near Sunset Manor, close enough to visit his grandfather daily, but far enough to maintain the independence they both needed. More importantly, he had enrolled in a community college program for medical assistants, inspired by the compassion he had witnessed from Margaret O'Sullivan and the medical team during Jean's hospitalization. "I never thought I'd be going back to school at my age," Tommy admitted as they worked together in comfortable silence. "But watching how those nurses and doctors took care of you, it made me want to be part of something that matters." The financial pressures that had once seemed insurmountable had been eased by an unexpected source. Jean's case had attracted the attention of the Veterans Administration, which had finally acknowledged the connection between his Korean War service and his recent medical crisis. The disability benefits that followed weren't substantial, but they were enough to cover his assisted living expenses and provide a small cushion for unexpected costs. More importantly, the community that had formed around Jean's crisis had evolved into something lasting and meaningful. Margaret O'Sullivan had postponed her retirement to help establish a new grief counseling program at Sunset Manor, recognizing that many elderly residents were struggling with losses similar to Jean's. Dr. Coleman had become a regular visitor, bringing her daughter Emma for weekend visits that filled the facility with the laughter of a child who treated every elderly resident like a beloved grandparent. The reading of Martha's letters had become a weekly ritual for Jean and Tommy, a way of keeping her memory alive while allowing both men to process their grief in healthy ways. They had discovered that Martha had written extensively about her hopes for Tommy's future, her pride in the young man he was becoming, and her confidence that he would find his way to a meaningful life despite the challenges he faced. "She wrote about you more than anyone else except me," Jean told Tommy during one of their Sunday afternoon sessions. "She was so proud when you got sober, so worried when you were struggling to find work. She made me promise to take care of you if anything happened to her, but I think maybe she knew that taking care of you would end up saving me too." The most unexpected development had been the relationship that bloomed between Dr. Rodriguez and the entire extended family that had formed around Jean's bedside. Her research into psychocardiology had been revolutionized by Jean's case, leading to grant funding for a new study on grief-related illness in elderly patients. She had asked Jean to serve as a consultant, sharing his experience with other patients who were struggling with similar conditions. "You're helping other people understand that healing is possible," she explained during one of their monthly follow-up appointments. "Your story is giving hope to families who thought they were watching their loved ones die from broken hearts." The speaking engagements had begun small. A presentation to the local Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter, a talk at the medical school where young doctors were learning about the connection between emotional and physical health. But word spread about the elderly veteran who had literally healed his broken heart through the power of human connection, and requests for appearances began arriving from across the country. Jean approached these opportunities with the same quiet dignity he had brought to every challenge in his life. He spoke simply and honestly about the importance of asking for help, about the way pride could become a prison, about the healing power of being truly known and loved by another person. His message resonated especially strongly with other elderly men who had been taught that emotional vulnerability was weakness. "I spent 2 years trying to die quietly, so nobody would have to worry about me," he would tell his audiences. "It turns out that letting people worry about you, letting them help carry your burdens, that's not weakness. That's the most courageous thing you can do." Tommy often accompanied his grandfather to these speaking events, sharing his own perspective on the healing that had occurred in their relationship. He talked about the importance of family connections across generations, about the way his grandfather's crisis had forced him to examine his own priorities and make different choices about how to spend his time and energy. The most meaningful engagement came when they were invited to speak at Dr. Coleman's hospital, addressing the medical staff who had witnessed Jean's remarkable recovery. Standing in the same emergency room where he had nearly died months earlier, Gene looked out at the faces of the people who had saved his life and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "You folks see tragedy every day," he told them. "You watch people fight battles they can't win, families torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. But I need you to know that what you do here, the compassion you show, the way you treat people with dignity even in their darkest moments, that has healing power that goes beyond any medicine you can prescribe." Dr. Coleman, who had struggled with burnout and cynicism before Gene's case, found her own renewal in watching his recovery. She had been reminded of why she became a doctor in the first place, of the profound privilege inherent in witnessing the most vulnerable moments of human existence. Gene's story had rekindled her faith in the possibility of healing, in the resilience of the human spirit when supported by genuine care and connection. As autumn settled over Central Texas, Gene and Tommy established new traditions that honored Martha's memory while creating space for their own relationship to flourish. They cooked Sunday dinner together in the small kitchen of Tommy's apartment, sharing stories and planning for the future in ways that neither man had imagined possible during the dark days of Gene's hospitalization. The photograph of Martha that had sat alone on Gene's nightstand for 18 months was now surrounded by pictures of the extended family that had grown up around his crisis: Dr. Coleman and Emma, Margaret O'Sullivan, Dr. Rodriguez, and even some of the other residents from Sunset Manor who had become like siblings in their shared experience of aging and loss. "Your grandmother would have loved all this fuss," Gene observed one evening as they looked through the photo albums that had become central to their weekly visits. "She always said that families weren't just made of blood relatives, they were made of people who showed up when things got hard and stayed around when things got better." The bumps on Gene's scalp had completely disappeared, leaving only the faintest traces of scars that served as reminders of how close they had come to losing each other. Dr. Rodriguez continued to monitor his heart function, amazed by the ongoing improvement in cardiac efficiency and rhythm stability. The broken heart syndrome that had nearly killed him had been replaced by something stronger, a heart that had learned how to heal itself through the power of being truly loved and understood. On a crisp December evening, as they worked together to hang Christmas lights in Martha's rose garden, Gene paused to watch his grandson's careful attention to the task. Tommy had developed Martha's gift for making ordinary moments feel sacred, for finding joy in simple domestic rituals that connected past and present. "You know," Gene said, his breath visible in the cold air, "I think we're going to be okay." Tommy smiled, understanding that this simple statement represented more hope and healing than either of them had dared imagine just a few months earlier. They were going to be okay, not because the pain of loss had disappeared, but because they had learned how to carry it together. Gene McCarthy's story proves that it's never too late to heal a broken heart, literally. At 85, this Korean War veteran was dying from grief, his body manifesting mysterious bumps that baffled doctors until they discovered the truth. Extreme emotional trauma was destroying his cardiovascular system. But here's what changed everything. The moment Gene stopped trying to carry his pain alone and allowed his grandson Tommy to share the burden, his heart began to heal itself. The medical team witnessed something extraordinary: love and human connection reversing what seemed like terminal illness. Gene's recovery wasn't just physical, it was the restoration of family bonds that had been severed by pride, miscommunication, and the American myth that real strength means suffering in silence. Today, Gene speaks to audiences across the country, sharing a simple but profound message. Asking for help isn't weakness. It's the most courageous act of love you can perform. His story reminds us that even in our golden years, even after devastating loss, we have the power to write new chapters filled with connection, purpose, and healing. Sometimes what breaks us open is exactly what lets the light back in. What loss in your life have you been carrying alone that might heal through sharing? Have you ever experienced the healing power of finally being truly understood by someone who loves you? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.